This slide provides a really high-level overview of what we will be chatting about today. First is a really high-level overview of the agreements, provincial territorial allocations and funding types. Then we will get into the funded activities, the changes in allocations over previous years, regular OLEP funding, additional OLEP funding programs, and bursaries. Then we will chat a little bit about reporting requirements. We'll share some information about the Provincial Advisory Committee. This provides a really high-level overview of how the funding agreements are structured. The overarching protocol is developed through pan-Canadian high-level negotiations. It describes a strategic framework that will guide both Canada and provincial and territorial governments in establishing the terms and conditions, principles, areas of intervention, and fiscal budgets in the bilateral agreements. Whereas the Canada-Alberta Agreement on Minority Language Education and Second Language Instruction is what is commonly known as the bilateral agreement between Alberta and the federal government. Its focus is to establish a framework of cooperation between the two parties, such as linguistic objectives, the Alberta Action Plan initiatives, reporting, and payment timelines. The current protocol for agreement and the bilateral agreement will expire on March 31st, 2023, which means that Alberta will be in a phase of renegotiation with the federal government to renew both, which will include a new action plan. Here you can see the overall percentage allocation to provinces and territories for French minority language funding, which includes both the base funding amount and the additional federal investments from 2020-2023, all under the 2019 to 2023 protocol. As you will see, Alberta will receive approximately 4% of the country's total. Here you can see the French second language, which of course includes both French immersion and FSL courses. These are the percentage allocations under the current 2019 to 2023 protocol. Alberta receives approximately 10% of the country's total. Here you can see the FSL additional federal investment per province and territory for the fiscal years 2021-22 to 2023-24. This is new federal funding that was announced in budget 2021, and Alberta will receive approximately 11% of the total additional FSL contributions. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on those. Within the agreements previously described, Alberta has allocated dollars for two types of funding. One, regular funding, which is noted within the bilateral agreement and Alberta's action plan. And two, additional funding, which is also called complementary funding, which is allocated at the discretion of Canadian Heritage through federal calls for proposals. So regular funding includes K-12 FTE student funding, K-12 and post-secondary project funding, and Alberta education-led programs for educators and students in K-12 programming, such as the individual teacher bursary and the Quebec-Alberta exchange programs. Additional funding includes complementary funding for French minority language or French second language projects, Francophone and French second language teacher recruitment and retention projects, and capital infrastructure projects for French minority language regional authorities or post-secondary institutions. Let's now take a look at funding allocations to Alberta for the 22-23 fiscal or school year. Federal funding supports all forms of French education in Alberta. Francophone education, also referred to as minority language education in Alberta, supports Section 23 rights holders and is taught nearly 100% in French. The provision of federal funding for minority language or Francophone education is based on Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Among other things, this section imposes an obligation on government to mobilize resources to preserve and promote minority language education. It also grants the right to an educational experience in minority language educational facilities that is substantively equivalent to that provided in majority language educational facilities. The provision of federal funding for French as a second language instruction is based upon a vision for a bilingual Canada. This vision is clearly identified in the federal government's action plan for official languages. Within Alberta, French immersion and French as a second language vary in their amount of instruction taught in French. French immersion is mostly taught in French with the intent of creating bilingual students in English and French. French as a second language is a standalone French course taught in English schools or post-secondary institutions. As announced in Budget 2021, the federal government proposed to provide an additional $180.4 million over 3 years, starting in 21-22, to Canadian Heritage to support students across the country in achieving greater levels of bilingualism. In particular, the federal government would like to see the rate of bilingualism in Canada increase from 17.5% to 20% by 2036. Though Alberta knew a portion of that $180.4 million would be coming to the province in 21-22, the federal government only determined the yearly breakdown of funding allocations in February of this year, making it too difficult to allocate any additional FSL funds to this past fiscal year. Instead, upon approval of the Education Minister and the federal government, those funds for 21-22 have been deferred to 22-23 and 23-24. This funding will be used, among other things, to help provinces and territories meet the strong demand from students and parents for spaces in French immersion, to foster and rebuild all French second language programs that might have been negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to boost the existing strategy for French language teacher recruitment and retention. Alberta's portion of the regular funding is divided between minority language Francophone education and French second language instruction, and each of those respective portions is divided between education at 77% and advanced education at 23%. A PDF version of this overview detailing how Alberta distributes OLEP funding for the school year is available on the OLEP webpage in the funded activities section. For French minority language education, the regular funding that goes to Alberta Education is further divided, with $55,000 going to the individual teacher bursary program, or ITB, and $6,029,635 going to the Francophone regional authorities as student FTE funding and project funding. It is important to note that the amount going to the ITB program remains the same as in 21-22, as participation has been lowered due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will provide more information about the ITB program later in this section. The 4 French minority language regional authorities in Alberta collaborate with the Fédération de Conseils Scolaires Francophones de l'Alberta, or FCSFA, in this allocation and in designing and implementing the initiatives included in the Alberta Action Plan. Noted on this slide are some examples of initiatives at the K-12 level that utilize regular student FTE and project funding within minority language education. Some of those include promotional activities to increase the visibility of the Francophone system, the provision and support of full-time kindergarten, access to specialized services for students, resource development with the help of organization, cultural and leadership activities for students, creation of partnerships to enhance student experience, provision of mental health related activities for students, and professional learning opportunities for staff. I will now turn it over to Monique to speak to this slide.
Thanks, Regina. So for French minority language education at the post-secondary level, advanced education will receive approximately $1.8 million, which we will then disperse to institutions which currently offer French minority language programming under Alberta's Action Plan. Noted on this slide are a number of examples of initiatives at the post-secondary level that utilize regular project funding. Promotion of programs to increase student enrollment in minority language instruction, development of online programming, expansion of postgraduate programs, creation and development of non-credit continuing education and training, and fostering of research activities.
Thank you, Monique. For French second language, the regular funding that goes to Alberta Education is further divided, with $100,000 going to the ITB, $20,000 towards the Quebec-Alberta Student Exchange Program, and $11,943,726 towards student FTE funding, and another $826,491 towards project funding. As with the minority language ITB allocation, the amount going to the program has been lowered for 22-23 as participation has been lowered due to the pandemic. The Department of Education will advise each school authority, charter, and independent school of their annual allocation of federal funding in the spring for the following school year, using the student FTE calculations finalized in February prior to the start of the school year. As of 2021, second language funding rates per FTE funded student are on a sliding scale. This means that student authorities and all funding recipients with a lower number of FTE funded students will receive slightly more per FTE funded student. This is to ensure school authorities and private and charter schools with smaller French immersion programs and French as a second language courses receive adequate program funding for their programs. The sliding scale and specific FTE rates will be found in the funding manual for school authorities once updated, I believe, in the fall. In order to provide value, allocations less than $1,000 will not be issued and will be redistributed to remaining participating school authorities and independent schools. Noted here are some FSL initiatives that utilize regular student FTE funding. Those include activities to promote student recruitment and retention, support for literacy and numeracy initiatives, expansion of French immersion programs, provision of cultural and enrichment activities such as Carnival, French for the Future or virtual exchanges, and professional training for school staff. As of 2021, Alberta Education has shifted a larger allocation of regular funding from projects over to the student FTE model, which will provide school authorities with more flexibility in managing their own initiatives and enable them to collaborate with regional school boards with common interests at their own discretion. The selection of projects to receive funding was made based on previously granted projects that have shown significant success over the last 7 years, or proposals that were submitted for complementary funding that showed significant promise and were not approved at the federal level. Additionally, these projects extend beyond the regular operations of the school authority or organization. They seek to advance or enhance French immersion and/or French as a second language instruction. They are collaborative, involve multiple partners, meet current needs present across the province, and are far-reaching, providing support to funding recipients and school authorities across large regions and/or the entire province. Alberta Education will revise the allocation of project funding with the new protocol beginning in 23-24.
For French second language education at the post-secondary level, advanced education will receive approximately $3.8 million, which will then disperse to the institutions which currently offer French as second language programming under Alberta's action plan. Advanced education will revise the allocation of project funding for both FML and FSL initiatives with the new protocol beginning in 2023-24.
Thank you, Monique. Again, noted on this slide are a number of examples of initiatives, both at the K-12 and post-secondary level that utilize regular project funding. So on the K-12 side, that includes resource development and professional learning activities through such organizations as the ARPDC, FLRC, MRFIP, and ISLE, DELF and DELF, credentialing centers and examinations, school and student twinnings and exchanges, and French resource centers such as the Southern Alberta French Resource Center. Monique?
On the post-secondary side, some initiatives are development of new French courses, support for the delivery of existing programs, expansion and development of the DELF, professional learning activities, promotion of community outreach and cultural activities, and research initiatives.
So in addition to the regular annual funding that is guaranteed each year, provinces can apply for additional federal funding each year for specific projects or goals. There are 3 categories of applications for additional funding. These include capital projects for minority language education, Francophone and French language teacher recruitment and retention, or TRR projects, and complementary projects. As you can see, the objectives of each additional funding stream vary. Complementary projects could apply to either French minority language or French second language institutions. They are dependent on federal priorities and investments and change each year. For instance, the last complementary call for proposals focused on one-time projects at the post-secondary level in the minority language. The aim was to stabilize or build institutional capacity to deliver quality post-secondary education programming. The teacher recruitment and retention strategy also applies to both French minority language and French second language initiatives. However, its focus is more narrow in that activities funded under this strategy are expected to support initiatives that address the teacher shortage in minority French language schools, as well as in French immersion and French second language programs, in the hopes that more teachers are available to teach in these systems in both urban and rural settings. Finally, infrastructure projects are aimed at the construction of community, educational, and cultural infrastructure in official language minority communities. The infrastructure projects could be related to either educational or post-secondary institution. To be eligible, infrastructure projects must be aimed at 1, renovating or expanding existing buildings, 2, constructing new buildings in one of the following categories: school community centers, community spaces in schools, or learning or community spaces within post-secondary institutions, or 3, acquiring essential furniture and or equipment. The federal government issues an annual call for proposals for each of the 3 funding categories described. The dates for these calls for proposals are not fixed, and provinces and territories are working with PCH to develop a comprehensive timeline for future calls for proposals to better able us to plan. To submit a provincial application, the Alberta government collaborates with educational partners to create and submit an application. Educational partners may include school authorities, independent or charter schools, post-secondary institutions, and educational associations. After submitting the application, Alberta works with the federal government to answer its questions and clarify parts of the application as needed. The federal government decides which projects to approve and informs the Alberta government. The Alberta government then communicates the federal government's decision to stakeholders and helps set up next steps for each approved project. Alberta works closely with funding recipients to create for the federal government. This report shows how funding recipients spent the money and if the project meets pre-identified success goals. Unless otherwise specified in the application form, all funding recipients are required to match any federal funding received through these additional funding categories. Once a project is approved and the schedule finalized and translated into both official languages, Alberta Education posts the schedule to the OLEP webpage. If you are interested in looking at the additional funding projects that have been approved in Alberta since 2018, you can read about them on the OLEP webpage on the Funded Activities section under Additional OLEP Funding. Pan-Canadian official language programs, which include Odyssey, Explore, and Destination Click, help young people improve their language skills in English and in French. These programs are funded through the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, so Alberta does not allocate any of its OLEP funding towards these programs. The ITB program gives eligible teachers up to $2,200 each year for post-secondary courses, training, and professional development in French. Applications are accepted year-round, so please spread the word. Applications for the 22-23 school year opened on March 1st, 2022. For more information and to apply, please visit the ITB webpage. The Quebec-Alberta Student Exchange Program pairs high school students from Alberta with students in Quebec to attend school together for 12 weeks in Alberta and 12 weeks in Quebec. Alberta Education allocates $20,000 of its second language OLEP funding towards this program. Now we're going to review the upcoming reporting requirements and some of the changes that have occurred from last year. I would first like to reiterate the importance of this reporting and how much the efforts you have made in completing the new OLEP report forms and funding commitment forms have made a difference. These forms have been critical in the development of the Provincial Action Plan, part of the Canada-Alberta multi-year agreement, and in demonstrating the OLEP funds are being used according to the parameters outlined in the protocol. Under the terms and conditions of the current protocol, these are the areas of intervention for years 2020 through 2023. The definitions of each area of intervention may differ slightly between minority language education and second language instruction. The definitions are provided in Appendix A of the protocol. On the OLEP webpage in the reporting section under resources, you will also find a fact sheet with the definitions of each area of intervention, along with examples of activities that support each one. We have also built the definitions right into the commitment form and report form, so you don't have to have multiple pages open at once when you complete the forms. I would like to point out that as of 2020, funding recipients can choose to invest federal funding towards one, all, or a combination of the areas of intervention. It is your choice. What does your area need? I would also like to confirm that all regular federal monies received must be matched 50-50 by the funding recipient by provincial monies already received. It is also important to note that all federal funding received must be reported back to us to ensure the terms and conditions of the protocol are met. In April of each year, we will advise school authorities of funding allocations for the following school year. At the same time, we will release the OLEP funding commitment form, which is due back to the department at the end of June of that same school year. This will tell us how you plan to allocate your funding using the areas of intervention previously discussed and is required in order to receive the first OLEP payment. The OLEP report form for the current school year will also be released in April, which is due in mid-September of the next school year, and will advise if you spent federal funding as previously planned or if you had to transfer funds between the areas of intervention. The allocation amounts and both forms will be posted to the OLEP webpage in the reporting section under resources. In October, following receipt and approval of the previous school year's report, the department will release the final 20% payment for the previous school year. If the report form for the previous school year and the commitment form for the current school year were submitted and approved, we will then release the initial payment for the current school year in November. Currently, this is set at 80% for both FTE funding and project funding. For 22-23, the funding commitment form will apply to both education and advanced education recipients. These funding commitment forms secure your institution's funding for the upcoming school year by establishing a commitment to allocate the OLEP funds according to the terms of the protocol. The first step in completing the commitment form is to find your school authority, or post-secondary institution's total funding allocation for the upcoming school year. This can be found linked on the OLEP webpage in the reporting section under resources, or in the case of post-secondary institutions, directly from the action plan. From there, complete the commitment form by showing which areas of intervention you plan to allocate the funding and how you plan to match the funding. Recall as well that all funding recipients are required to match each dollar of OLEP funding received. Alberta Education and Advanced Education will be in touch with funding recipients who have, after you have submitted the funding commitment form, and may follow up with some requests for clarification before approving the form. I will now turn it over to Monique.
Thank you. The information school authorities and post-secondary institutions provide on the report form is critical for Alberta to fulfill its requirement in reporting to the federal government on the province's activities supported by OLEP funding and the matching contributions. After submitting the report, our OLEP offices will be in touch with you and may follow up with questions or comments before approving the report. In regards to school authorities, once your school authority's report is submitted by September 15th and approved, the final 20% payment for the previous school year will be released. Once your school authority's commitment form is submitted on June 30th and then approved, the report is submitted on September 15th and approved, and the initial 80% payment for the current school year will be released. Due to our commitment to the federal government, we are unable to release any new OLEP funding until both reports have been received and approved. Advanced Education has requested a deadline of August 31st for commitment report forms, and as you'll note, the full 100% payment for 22-23 has already been received by the post-secondary institutions. If at any point you have questions about completing your form, feel free to call or email the OLEP office, and our contact information can be found on the form itself or at the bottom of each OLEP, at the bottom of each page on the OLEP website. For advanced education stakeholders, we intend to contact you directly to set up meetings to discuss this.
Thank you. So my question is about the areas of intervention and matching funds in those areas. So for example, in learner participation, if I'm going to put, I don't know, 130,000 of OLEP funds there, does my school division have to match or exceed in that specific area of intervention? Or do I have the flexibility to say, I'm going to put 30,000 here, but my school division is going to contribute $1 million in a different area of intervention.
Julie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I can take that. Thank you for that question. The federal government does require that we match within the area of intervention. So it doesn't have to be each initiative, but as long as your totals, your matching is at least equivalent as the federal contribution within that area intervention. That's what needs to happen.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies.
So we're now moving into the last section. We would just like to provide a little bit of information about the OLEP PAC teams. So Alberta Education's OLEP Provincial Advisory Committee, or PAC, is comprised of proportional representation of members from diverse geographical regions, including French minority language and second language school authorities, rural and urban school authorities, public and separate school authorities, charter and independent schools, and officials from Alberta Education. The committee discusses and strategizes direction and leadership to ensure the vitality of Francophone education and French second language programming in Alberta through targeted funding, enriched program delivery, and collaborative action. It is not a decision-making body. Membership is renewed every 2 years, and stay tuned to the next ADM OLEP update this August for more information on upcoming PAC vacancies. Monique, would you like to share some information about your PAC team?
Yeah, sure. So advanced education also, we have aligned with the PAC committee that's happening in the K-12 system. So ours runs almost virtually exactly the same. However, we have a less formal approach, having it been the first committee. Volunteer membership is open, and you can stay on the committee as long as you like there. So we anticipate our meetings will be held quarterly. They'll be 1 to 2 hours in length, depending on the agenda and items and discussion involved. And yeah, so if you're interested in being a part of that committee and you haven't received an invite, just reach out to me and let me know. As I mentioned, PAC members are volunteer and will be asked to sit for at least 1 year at a time. And you may choose to stay on at the end of each fiscal year. You may exit the committee. We leave the choice to you. And there's no number or limit to the number of representatives from each institution. So we are welcoming anyone from your SFO to your professional teaching staff. Anybody who's interested is welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
I'll just also jump in there really quickly, Regina.
Yeah.
So I will mention that we are just updating the webpage. The update should be up this week, where that information will be there. So you won't have to wait until the August OLEP update to see information about the K-12 PAC, information about joining PAC this year.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. So yeah, just check out the OLEP webpage for more information, links, and resources. And if you don't know the OLEP webpage web address, you can simply Google OLEP Alberta and you'll be able to find it there.